Hi, I'm Susan Orlean.
Hi, I'm Liz Gilbert.
And we are here to talk to each other, which is thrilling. And I would be happy to talk to Liz anytime at all, but this is sort of a nice occasion since it's at the very brink of the movie coming out based on her book, and as I've had some experience with that, it's really interesting for me to talk to somebody who's about to go through that, but also many, many other topics that, frankly, I'm more interested in. But or we could also look at this as a Julia Roberts, Meryl Streep smackdown.
I wish we had their avatars that could sort of fight each other in our name.
Yeah,
that would be kind of cool too.
Remember, Meryl was in River Wild, and so she is kind of ripped.
That's true. That's true.
She's strong. So
that's true. But Julia was in Pretty Woman, and she has really long legs.
That's true. Wow.
And that can always be a great asset when it comes to street fighting, as we all know.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, especially if you've seen Blade Runner and you know if you saw Daryl Hannah ever kill anybody with her legs, it definitely is a spooky thought. Well, are you excited? Are you dreading this?
No, I'm not dreading it. I'm excited and I'm happy about it. And I have to tell you, even before we begin, that you and I share a mutual friend, Miss Ann Patchett. And I was speaking to her this morning, and we were talking about this, and she was saying how funny it is that there's an assumption. She said there's a certain level of like good fortune that you're allowed to have, and then when you get above that, the expectation is that people want you to be dreading it, and they want it to turn into something really bad. But sometimes it's just good news, you know.
Yeah.
And that's sort of how I feel about this. I think I saw the movie already. I think it's lovely, and you know, the whole Eat, Pray, Love experience has just been a blessing and a boon, and I'm, you know, happy about every part of it.
Yeah.
So, but the thing that I'm really happy about right now is this feeling of watching from a little bit of a distance as Julia Roberts takes that sort of Eat, Pray, Love spotlight and she moves into it, and I feel like I'm watching her sort of take over the mantle of that, and I'm delighted to have her do it. And she can do it. You know, she can carry it in a nice way. So,
will that be a little bit of a relief for you?
Yeah.
In a way?
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. What were you saying?
Well, I just think that as it happens, it was Anne who was saying this to me, that people connect to books in a very emotional way, and sometimes they connect in a way that is almost overwhelming for the author. I think I've had that less because I don't think that I represented the same prominence in my book that you did, and that people connect to you and feel that you can give them wisdom, and that is probably a burden once it's existing outside your role as a writer.
Well, it's simply something I can't give people, you know. So it's burdensome only in that it requires that I spend a fair bit of time explaining to people that I'm terribly afraid that I can't offer them wisdom, you know. And then once we get past that, you know, it seems to be okay. But you know, there's a little bit of, you know, we have to make things clear. Sort of,
right.
And most people get that very quickly,
Right.
and some don't. But those people are mentally ill, and there aren't very many of them. There are just a few, and I don't run into them very often. But
I think it's an interesting thing. I mean, I had this experience doing a reading with Alice Sebold, who wrote The Lovely Bones, and in that same way, I think there were a lot of people who. Women who had been abused when they were young or lost somebody to a sexual predator, and the intensity of their connection to her, I could see where it could be overwhelming and even scary, because it's an expectation that you step outside your book into a different kind of role in people's lives.
Right, to be teacher, healer, the only one who understands me, you know, the only one who can help. And I, at the beginning of Eat, Pray, Love, I used to write back to every letter that I got, and a lot of them were calls for help, you know, and I would kind of throw myself into that. And I remember calling a friend of mine who is a psychologist, who's a wonderful woman who gives her life to, to saving people. And I had gotten a very disturbing letter that began with something like, it's the middle of the night and there's nobody else I can turn to except you. And I said, what am I supposed to do with this? And she said, do they have yellow pages? And it sounded sort of harsh, but she was saying, you're the only really? There's no minister, there's no therapy group, there's no church, there's no, really? And don't feel that you need to be that for somebody who you don't know as well as they feel they know you. That's kind of the trick. And so I've sort of had to learn how to manage that. But I have to make clear that 99% of the people that I encounter who've read Eat, Pray, Love very simply are wonderful. It's if you have to have a fan base, having a fan base of people who are generally middle-aged women who've had some disappointing love experiences in their lives is actually, it's not like I have Stephanie Meyer's fans or Stephen King's fans, they're nice ladies who've been sad, and they couldn't be more generous and they couldn't be more kind. And actually I wanted to ask you what the demographic is of people who adore you, because I would count myself on that list, but I'm not sure what my fellow Susan Orlean worshipers look like. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about your fans.
4'7". No, they're it's a real range. When and I think it's a variety from young women who would like to fashion a career similar to mine, and they're young, either students or young journalists, and then the range of people who come to readings, I would say it's probably a real mix between men and women, and a real age range from. I think that after adaptation came out, there were a whole lot of young people who came to the movie because they know Spike Jonze.
Right.
And they weren't readers of The New Yorker, so that was a whole different demographic.
Right.
And then, of course, all of the orchid people and the plant people.
Right.
But also people who I think were drawn to the idea of passion being a formative fact in anyone's life. So it is a real range, but I've noticed more, or very often in the last couple of years, it's a lot of young journalists who I think are trying to figure out in this new world order of journalism kind of disappearing into the ether, or at least the traditional forms of it, who are saying, "What I want to do this kind of writing, and where will it be done? Where can I do this kind of writing?"
What do you tell them?
I'm so really puzzled. I taught at NYU this year, and at the end of the year, my students were saying, can we spend a day just talking about the future as professionals? And I said to them, all the advice that I used to give is really out of date at this point. I used to say to people, move to a city you like, preferably a small city, get a job at some little paper and just work your butt off and write and write and write. And that's just not nearly as possible anymore. And I don't think the equivalent is to say start a blog. I don't think it's the same thing. So I've really ended up a little bit speechless when I'm asked that kind of advice, except if you want to learn how to write, read and write as much as you can. Does it lead immediately to a paycheck? I'm afraid. I don't know what the other alternative is, although recently I've been mentioning to people that as these online presences of newspapers and magazines grow and grow, they really are looking for writers. And there will be a place for writers, and I believe that firmly. It's just taking a different shape.
I ask you because people ask me the same thing, and I find myself, I had a beautiful speech about how to do this that I used to tell people even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that's obsolete, and it's, and you want to give hope and encouragement. And I'm not sure what to say to people. And one of the things that I heard recently that I thought was really interesting, you were mentioning NYU. I have a friend who just graduated from, or her nephew just graduated from NYU with a degree in music, and he said something that I thought was so cool for a 20-year-old to come up with. He said the situation with the changing media world is that it's parboiling away anybody who wants to do this work for any other reason than that they love it. Because there's no longer, isn't that kind of great? There's no longer any promise of huge prosperity from becoming a rock star or a giant journalist, or it really is forcing people to decide. It's kind of a purifying ritual, is what he was saying, and he said what you're going to be left with is people who are doing the work for the love of it.
Well, I think that's nice. Really part of. My friend Kurt Anderson had written a book some months ago called Reset about how the hard times there are advantages of shaking out people who have chosen to do things just because they offered a lot of money. Right. And when I was in college, everybody who just thought, I want to make some easy, big money became a lawyer. Right. And we had way too many lawyers, and most of them were very unhappy. They hated their jobs. Right. And now I'm not sure that anybody would become a lawyer unless they actually wanted to be a lawyer. Right. Because it's not. It doesn't offer that as an easy. Yeah. An easy justification. I don't know that being a writer ever did, but I certainly think now. I've always believed, maybe I'm too much of a believer in meritocracy, but I've always really thought if you want to write and you really love it and you really care about it and you have some modicum of talent, it'll work out. Yeah. It'll happen. It may not be easy, and I still believe that. And I still think that what it may do is it calls on your enterprise and your devotion and ingenuity more than it ever has. Right. Well, the thing I also tell young people who want to be writers now is, I don't know what the future looks like, but whichever one of you can figure it out is going to shape it. You'll be really rich. Is going to get really rich and really powerful, because there's an opening here for somebody to find something and invent something that I can't even imagine or name, and that I'm way too old to have any part of. So, so go be that person. I hate thinking that I'm too old to figure that stuff out. And I'm not afraid of change, but I also feel that when I see my notes that I use for my go get 'em speech that I would give to students and, just people interested in being a writer. I mean, I could probably use them as bedding in my chicken coop at this point, because almost all the advice is pretty useless at this point. It's pretty outdated. I'm glad you mentioned your chicken coop, because I have a lot of questions about that. I'm full of answers. In fact, it happens. I'm sitting here. I don't know if you can see this. I can't see you, unfortunately. All right, but I'm sitting in my library, and for what it's worth, my high literary taste, all the books I'm sitting with are How to Raise Chickens, Pocket Full of Poultry, and my husband's business school alumni magazine. So that's cool. Yeah, that's the high-toned reading that I have here. Did you start off as a gardener and then grew into a chicken farmer? And I also want to know if you think there's some sort of connection between farming and writing, or gardening and writing, because I know that you're a gardener and I'm a gardener and Anne's a gardener, and it seems like certainly most of the women writers that I know are kind of passionately in the dirt, and I'm just curious if you think there's any sort of trend in that direction. Well, I think that in general there's a trend and there has been for a decade or so, towards gardening, but I also think that when you're doing something like writing, and I'm sure you must feel this, there are times when I just desperately want to do something physical. I want I want to have my hands in the dirt. I want something that's got a very particular and specific arc that is very logical and that is sort of nurturing, and it's a different kind of connection that to me is an enormous relief from a day of sitting in front of a computer writing. And also, and I'm sure this is true for you, when you're out in the world doing reporting, that's one kind of life. When you come back home and you're writing, and the solitariness and the sort of vacuum of that is in front of you can feel so unreal. But then I'm there gardening, and I just get tremendous satisfaction out of it. And I happen to like the chores of gardening. I don't design a garden. I don't, get into the fussiness. I love weeding. I love pruning. I'm a destructive gardener. And I even love, taking care of my chickens, just hauling the feed in. And I like the physicalness of it. And I do think it's a real contrast in the best sense. I mean, what draws you to gardening?
I think it's the same. Well, I grew up with it. I grew up on a farm, and we had chickens and goats, and my mom was a master gardener, but I went far out of my way to not learn anything from her about it when I was a kid. And because I hated the chores of it. I hated chores in general. And my sister and I have talked, my sister's also a writer, and we've talked about how we think we both ended up as writers because the only way that you were allowed to get out of chores was if you were reading, because reading was really respected in our family. And if you had your face in a book, nobody was going to come and pull you out of it and make you milk the goats. And so maybe that just became our sort of refuge away from all that. But now both of us have ended up being gardeners and little suburban farmers like everybody else.
Right.
So it's and I'm amazed at how much I accidentally learned despite my efforts to not pay attention to anything that my mom was trying to teach me.
Same here. I mean,
you know more than you knew. But I think that it's the idea that you're doing something elemental versus ethereal, because the writing is ethereal and you're making some, you're just working with air molecules of thought, and there's nothing you can dig into, and the garden is elemental. It's sun, rain, earth, and a very linear product.
Right. I mean, do you feel, and I certainly do, is that there is never a correct result with writing. There are a million. I mean, there are uncountable versions of every sentence, let alone every book and every story.
Right.
So it's always leaves you feeling that there could have been many, many other ways of doing it. With
other outcomes.
Yeah, and with gardening or working with my chickens, it feels like there's a specific goal. If I get a tomato, that's the right outcome. If I got a beautiful flower, that's the correct outcome. And there's not that feeling of the endlessness. And the lack of finality of writing. I mean, someone once asked me about how long I work on a piece, and I said, well, until my editor tells me that if they don't get it, I'm going to get fired. I mean, when would you ever be done otherwise? Nothing is ever perfect. Nothing is ever complete. So it becomes endless. And these chores are so satisfying.
Right. You can check them off the list.
Yeah. I also...
Done. Weeds gone. Tomatoes watered.
Right.
Finished.
Chicken eggs collected. I'm also a bit of a tool geek. I love going to Agway and buying stuff, and thinking, there's a new feeder for I'm going to try this with the chickens. And I love, with a writer, how many times can you buy a new computer? It's so boring.
Do you like the chores of writing? Do you know what I mean? Like, do you like editing? Do you like research? Do you like the sort of equivalent of the barnyard work?
I actually like editing a lot. And I think that I may have missed my calling, because I think that has that same concrete feeling where I can read something and think, now this is better. this is definitely better. I mean, taking material that exists and shaping it is so different from looking at a blank page and thinking, now what? I like when I like typing up my notes. I like learning. I mean, I like that part of it a great deal. How about you? Are you somebody who...
I love it. I like the whole... one of the questions I wanted to ask you was if you like writing, because I do.
Yeah.
I don't like it's not like it's always fun, but I find it to be such an enjoyable puzzle, and I like, I like throwing myself into to learning about a world I know nothing about very quickly, and then trying to translate it, and I love editing, and I think Trollope said something like, that he would write for 3 hours a day and then reward himself with an hour of editing, like as if it were ice cream, here, I'm going to let you, cut the huge sections out of this. And that's the best and most exciting part of it for me. And I know that it's quite the opposite for a lot of other people. You have to think it's fun to cut stuff, I think. And I think a lot of people don't like to.
I love cutting stuff. I love it. I feel like sometimes I think, as a matter of fact, with my editors, I always say, hey, look, if we need to cut this for space, please let me do it. And I think they think, diva, she's got to cut her own words. And I think instead, no, it's so much fun. Let me see if I can end up cutting 25% out of this and have it not only be not noticeable, but actually be better.
It's always better.
I know,
25%
isn't that
shorter.
horrible? It's
always better.
It's so horrible to admit it, but it is always better, and it's always
better.
It's just tighter and cleaner, and you're down to the stuff that really matters, and and I really love writing when it's coming. I hate the feeling of being stuck, and I feel miserable, but fortunately, and I've got to find wood to knock on, that happens less than when it feels like it's coming. And then I'm really excited, and I think, boy, this is dreamy. It's like a magic trick. There was no sentence, and now there's a sentence, and it's pretty. And
I always feel like an archaeologist when I'm looking for the hidden door, like you're knocking, like speaking of knocking on wood or something, maybe not even an archaeologist, but sort of like you're probing through a house and you're just knocking and knocking until you find there's a secret passageway, and you're sort of Nancy Drewing your way through the house. Like, where is it? I know there has to be a way to get from this dining room to this living room. It exists already. You just, where is it? Like, where's the lever? Where's the clock that when you turn it upside down, it becomes, and that's the part that I think is genuinely fun.
Yeah.
And so exciting when you get it. And the skies part.
Yeah. But do you find that when people ask you how you came to this sentence or that word choice, are you able to answer it, or is it more intuitive? Is it hard to really explain how you came to certain writing decisions?
I think it's intuitive, but I think it's also, the only thing I can compare it to is that my grandmother, who's 97, tried to teach me once how to bake apple pie, because she's the best. She bakes the best apple pie in the entire world. And I said, I'm going to spend the afternoon with her, and she's going to show me how to do this. And, she's standing there, and she says, well, the first thing you do is you cut the apples, and you sort of feel them to see how heavy they are, and how, how waterlogged they are, because that's going to change how much sugar you need to put in, or maybe you feel like you need to put, and the whole thing was just, she had baked an apple pie every day at that point for about 75 years.
Oh my God.
And how was she going to show me how to do that? And I'm sitting there taking notes like weigh apples for density. How are you going to teach somebody how to feel what's needed? And I think that with writing, there's an enormous amount, you do this too, and I do this too, and a huge amount of research, that you do before you probably even begin.
Right.
And then you arm yourself with all that research, and then you go into it with all your technique. And then the last bit of it is a little bit of magic, but it's magic that comes from having done this every day for years and years and years.
Right.
It's almost like you have like you're a downer, like what is this? Dowser? Is that what they call it?
A
When you have the
dowser.
dowsing stick?
Yeah.
And you just feel where the water is underneath there. And I don't know how you teach somebody to do that. That's where I ran into trouble when I taught for a little while. I'd be curious to know how you did as a teacher, but how do you teach that other than showing somebody that it exists and then sending them on their way and hoping that they have the discipline and the steadfastness to stay with it long enough to get there?
Right. I think that in part it's encouraging people to trust their instincts and try to find the water, so to speak, as a dowser, and not paying attention to what they think a writer is supposed to sound like. But I think finding it, it's inspiration. I mean, that is why not only does not everybody do it, but no one sounds the same. I mean, there are so many writers I admire, and none of them sound alike. They all found that their own way in the pieces they write. And my guess is if you asked them all to write the exact same story, they would all do it in an entirely different way, because they just came to trust their version of how they see the world, rather than thinking this is the proper way to write something. Right.
Did you find when you were a younger writer that you were trying to do something that you had seen or do something that you had read?
Yeah. Did you? I mean, I definitely did. And I remember at one point, my editor at the New Yorker very gently said to me, I was clearly imitating another writer. And my editor said to me in a very gentle way, I see what you're doing, but don't do that. Do it the way you would do it. And I'm not saying it quite the way he did, but it was just a way of saying, imitating, you're trying to sound the way you think a writer sounds, but what it sounds like is you writing the way you think a writer sounds, and not really seeing things for yourself and expressing them. But I mean, the confidence in doing that is something that I really think is a matter of time. I mean, do you think your work has gotten stronger as you've gotten older and more experienced?
I think so. I mean, it's gotten easier, because I think there's less obstacles, because I'm more likely to just begin with my own voice, and there's less that has to be removed. But I have to tell you a cute story, which is that when I was 24, 25 and working for Spin Magazine, I was lucky enough to have an interview at lunch meeting at the New Yorker one day with an editor whose name I can now not remember, not that it matters, but I brought some samples of my work, and he had read my work, and I said, do you think that maybe there's a place for me here? And he said, Susan Orlean is already working here.
Oh, God!
And I just wanted to let you know when you said,
so funny.
who I was imitating.
That's
who
really
I was imitating
funny.
Was you.
Well, I'm flattered. That's really funny.
And they already had one, so I had to go off and become something else.
That's really funny. Oh my God! Later we'll have to discuss which editor it was who told you this. I want to know. But I also feel like the best training anyone could have is to read the writers they love and imitate them in the sense of figuring out the way they put things together and sort of and coming to understand that process. And actually, I think it gives you your own confidence to think that's how someone's voice sounds, and this is the way I would say it. And it's a big leap, not always a comfortable one, to just make things on the page appear as they felt to you, and not think this has to sound the way I think of it. Right. Certainly you and I have done writing that's not traditional, and our interests are not traditional. So it's sort of not entirely uncharted by any means, but it's something where I'm glad at some point I no longer thought, do people write like this? Is it rather it was just me talking, basically.
Right. That's what I feel like when you said, "Does your work getting stronger?" It's getting. There's so much that I don't. There's so much affect that's gone. You know, where I just feel like I can get out of the way and just say what happened. You know, just tell the story. Just say what happened. It's that easy. You know, just say what happened as you saw it and as you experienced it. But you know, it took me 10 years to get to be able to do that. You know, to get close to being able to do that, rather than say the pleasing thing or the funny thing or the clever thing or the cunning different thing. You know, it just get out of the way. You know, so I feel like, but I think that's kind of maturity in general, you know. I feel like my life is easier now than it was 20 years ago for that same exact reason, you know. The losing of all of that stuff that you feel like you're supposed to be doing and the acceptance of what you actually are.
I think also
makes life easier.
Is it an appreciation of simplicity? I mean, I know that so much of the gadgetry and gimmickry of my younger writing, I feel more comfortable now, as you just said, just saying what I saw and describing it very plainly. Even my interest in language has evolved, that I've come to really love a certain kind of very plain language, and I think it's so strong and so muscular, and compared to I still love writing description, but I think it's so much leaner and cleaner now, the way I write it, than what I did 10, 15 years ago, where I felt like it had to be very embellished and full of flourish and cleverness. And I think it's also, it's reflected, as you say, in my life in general. I'm thinking about my clothing, and I'm much more comfortable now with a kind of simplicity that I think only comes from being confident. Or lazy, and depending.
You know what I was going to say? I go to bed at 9 o'clock, and I think my writing reflects that. I used to go to bed at 4 in the morning, and I think my writing reflected that. You know, it shows up. Whitman said that everything that you are will show up in your writing. Yeah. And that if you're a man who has to have a butler standing behind him when he eats, it will appear in your writing. Yeah. You know, and if you're sort of stripping away all that stuff, it's funny though, because I still have such an admiration for the bells and whistles and gadgetry that other people do. Yeah. You know, like Martin Amis is still one of my favorite writers, precisely because I can't do that. You know, I loved Everything is Illuminated. And there's certain books that I just marvel. How did somebody? What a bunch of cleverness. You know, my husband's Brazilian, and he always says, when people are very clever, he said they have so many words in their mouth, and he sort of marvels at it. And I feel like there are people who have so many words in their mouth and so many words in their head, and I love what they do with them, but it's not my voice. Yeah. And so I can read Martin Amis, and I can read. I'm trying to think of another, you know, like sort of witty trickster.
David Foster Wallace, or
Jonathan Safran Foer, you know, like somebody like that, whose name I'm probably mispronouncing because I realized I've never heard it said. Anyway, someone like that, you know, and then I go home and write my Yankee stripped down, here's what happened prose. But I think that's what I'm meant to be doing.
Right. And I think that actually, that's exactly it. I don't think that I appreciate. I'm actually drawn to writing that's not much like mine frequently. Yeah. I mean, I read fiction most of the time in my private reading time, and I love very dense, very layered. I love Indian fiction. I love that kind of really packed writing. It's certainly not the way I write, and sometimes I feel very jealous and think, God, I wish I did. I wish that were the way I thought and the way I process the world. But the authentic voice that's mine is I think, quite close to what ends up on the page, and it is it feels natural. It feels.
I don't think it's as important to be original as it is to be authentic, because I don't think there's any way to be original without being authentic.
Right.
You know, so otherwise it's you know. So I think, but I just think you can't realize that till you're older.
Right.
You know, and also, how can you be authentic when you're 23 and you don't know who you are anyway?
Oh God.
You know, how are you going to be true to a self you haven't even met? You know, so I think that you cast around and you play around and you try out different costumes and different hats and different voices, and then slowly kind of settle into your own being. And there's something that's so comfortable about that now in my writing that I just feel like. It's where I am my most authentic now. You know, it's where I wear the least number of masks. Is when I'm working now. There's a great comfort in that. I like it, and I guess maybe people think of comfort as being the death of art, but I don't know if I agree. I think that there's something wonderful about settling into what we're supposed to be doing. Yeah,
it's funny. I think there's a lot of myth about that. I had the great privilege of being at a artist colony for a couple of weeks, and it was almost unbearably hot. It was a heat wave, and there was no air conditioning, and it was miserable. And I complained about 26 hours a day about it, and someone had the nerve to say to me, "But isn't that good for your writing to be suffering?" And I said, "You know what? No. It's really bad for my writing. I'm really miserable. It has nothing to do with." And I think that we have, tortured artist is a very unfortunate catchphrase. There are probably wonderful artists who are tortured, but I think that's a coincidence more than a causal relationship.
There are wonderful dentists who are tortured.
Right.
You know? I'm not sure that creative artistic people need to own suffering.
No,
and
there's
I
a
definitely
nice
think they
spread.
shouldn't seek it.
Yeah, it's spread around. The suffering is spread around pretty well. But I also think that happiness is not necessarily detrimental to writing. And I remember a friend who was very depressed and was thinking about taking antidepressants, and said to me, with great concern, that she was worried that it would affect her writing, that if she were happy, if she were not depressed, that she'd lose her edge. And I do think that is it's a very interesting question. And why the idea that discomfort is more real than comfort, and why we've kind of fallen in love with that image of art coming out of. It must have some pagan basis, since it's a sort of theme repeated in religion that and spiritual idea that you achieve something through pain. And I'm not sure that air conditioning is quite on par with crucifixion, for instance, but it's
it depends on where you were.
Yeah, right.
Depends on the humidity.
Yeah, well, it was really hot, let me tell you, and I can't say it was very useful for getting work done, but the quiet. And this was something I was curious about, even though I always get very uncomfortable with the phrase "woman writer," because I mean, I don't know, I
prefer lady writer.
Or how about gal writer? Gal writers.
Gal writer, us gal writers.
Yeah. Lady. Oh, actually, I love the phrase "lady," and it's when applied ironically. But I've always. I mean, I do think there are different issues about being a writer and being also female. And I had a big argument with lots of people about it, about women being programmed to multitask. I hate that phrase, but just to be keeping many things in mind at once, and it's not all that helpful for trying to focus, which I think is so important in writing. And I certainly find it really hard, and harder now that I have a kid, certainly, but I think men are a lot better at putting blinkers on and doing nothing but their work, and with writing, that kind of focus is a great advantage.
I think also that men my experience is that they feel a little bit more entitled to make everything else to suffer in name of the work, because the work is so hallowed, and therefore the wife, the kids, they can all be neglected, and they'll all have to understand, that they need to be neglected, in order for the great work to be made, and I'm not sure that's a great attribute, but Anne Patchen and I talk about this a lot in our letters, that we both take care of anyone who comes within our orbit. It's how we are. It's what we do. We have house guest infestations, both of us, that last for months, and because we love people and care about them, invite them over and take and tend to them. And I remember her sending me a letter last year saying, "Do you think Philip Roth ever had to interrupt his novel because he had to change the sheets in the guest bedroom for the third time that week? Really? Did he ever? Did Updike ever have to put a novel aside because he promised his sister's kids he would take them to the Renaissance Fair? I don't think so. And I think that a lot of them had women in their lives who scurried around taking care of all that stuff, studio wives, and making sure that he was not disturbed between 10 and 4 p.m., so that he could get the work done. And I don't know any women who have anybody in their lives who does that, unless it's them, I mean, you have to sort of become the bodyguard of your own work. And I often feel when I'm writing that I'm typing with one hand and holding the door shut with the other, with my boot maybe, just like there's all these obligations and responsibilities and people that I take care of out there, they're sort of pounding down the door, and I don't know what we're to do about that, because I'm not quite willing to give up my loving care of all those people either. But it's the conundrum. And I think that there is a bit of it that's specific to the lady writer.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, and I think the proof is the fact that I doubt there's been any conversation in the history of recorded time, let alone recorded video, in which two male writers talked about how tough it was for them to work when they were wanting to be good fathers. I mean, or let alone, dealing with aged parents, or I just don't think. I think it's a different way of looking at the world and looking at life and your training and your whatever. Somehow it's embedded, and it's very tough. And this all began in this big a big discussion that I inadvertently had triggered when I just said that I think if you look at the ranks of nonfiction writers, at a certain level of recognition, you'll see how lopsided it is in terms of gender, and that I think in part it's just because it's a kind of reporting that takes time that's not easy to get if you're a woman, unless you're entirely single, and then you're probably taking care of your nieces and
your
nephews
boyfriend.
And your boyfriend, and
but it's also the other side of that, though, is that when I think about the work that I did, because I don't consider myself a journalist anymore, because I shouldn't be allowed to carry that badge anymore, because I haven't done any journalism in several years. But that's how I made my living all through my 30s and my late 20s and early 30s. The other piece of it, though, is that I got stories that men couldn't get, and I feel like that all the time. I felt like that with the novel that I wrote, the lobster fishing novel that I wrote called Stern Men. I had to go up to these lobstering islands off the coast of Maine, for huge amounts of time on end and work on lobster boats and go in people's homes and see how they spoke and how they lived. And as a woman, as a girl, really, because I was pretty young at the time that I did that, my enormous advantage was that I'm instantly trustworthy. I'm not going to rape anybody. I'm not going to take out a knife on anyone. I'm not going to steal anything from anybody. I walk into any part of the world and people hand me their baby. They'll put an infant in my arms. They'll let me into their house. They'll give me a glass of water. A man alone is a dangerous person, and a man knocking on your door is a dangerous person. Right. A woman knocking on your door never is, and so I often wondered when I was working as a journalist and traveling around the world, how do men do this? How do they get people to tell them things? Right. How do they get people to trust them? And how do they get people to open up? And how do they get people to share their heart? I honestly didn't know. And I would think about some of the stories that I did and some of the stuff that people gave me and think, I can't think of how a guy could get this. Right. And so there's that advantage that balances it out, I think, a little bit.
Right. Oh, I completely agree. And I think it's often forgotten in this conversation about how different it is for a man or a woman to be in this particular job, in this in the world of being out there trying to get people's stories, whether it's specifically as a journalist or as a writer. And I entirely agree. I've had people who didn't know me from Adam, never asked for any kind of credential, any proof that I was anything other than a bum and a vagabond, have me come in, sit with them, tell me their stories, and I just think it's an entirely different dynamic. I remember interviewing Joan Didion once, and she said this before.
I was just thinking about her when you said that.
Yeah, and she said not only being a woman, but being physically very small, which she is, that people never, and in Joan Didion's case, it's even more interesting because she has an incredibly sharp eye, and in some cases a very critical eye on the people she wrote about, but I think that they were sort of fooled into a kind of complacency because there's this tiny, really petite, quiet, church mousy woman who was just there, and if anything, they probably thought, I hope she's okay. Does she need water? Is she all right? And in fact, she's sitting there with the sharp pen and sharp eye about to write something very, very revealing and
about to throw you into the tiger cage,
right?
Which I don't do, and you don't do.
No,
I don't think of you as being somebody who does that. Have you ever done that?
No, not well. I've written pieces where the people were not happy afterward, but I've never gone into a piece and licked my chops, thinking, "Wow, I can't wait for this to be." I don't really look at the world that way, and I don't think I've ever looked at any of my subjects that way. I think I've come away, even from people in situations that I didn't like, wondering who are they, and how did this end up being what it is. I don't have the stomach to do that more aggressive kind of writing. It's just not, and I don't think it's really the way. I'm not drawn to stories where I'm immediately alienated from the people or the subject.
My sense of you is that you don't want to write about somebody that you don't think is fascinating and lovable.
And some of them are
or
really
peculiar.
weird, and and some of them have interests that I find very strange. But I feel that I'm thinking about writing about this children's beauty pageant down in the South, and it was a very disturbing hobby to me, but I felt a real tenderness towards the people I was writing about, because I thought, well, now, what is it that you're getting out of this that I don't understand? Because I don't believe you're a bad person. I just I just don't, culturally, this is so strange to me that but they were perfectly nice people. They were sweet people, actually.
Yeah.
And it was a real effort for me to try to figure out what makes them tick, and I found it quite gratifying to be able to come out of that thinking, okay, I understand a little more now. I still don't want to do this,
right? And
I don't like it, but I feel at least that I can say I understand it more.
Yeah, yeah.
And you've never set out to be an investigative journalist in any way. What's the sort of piece that you like doing the most?
I think the pieces I liked the most were the little subculture pieces, like what you just described would be something I would have loved to have done. And America's so good for that. One of the other thoughts, and maybe this is just very narrow-minded of me, but I always used to wonder, what do people who aren't American write about? Because we have this huge, crazy country with thousands of, petri dishes throughout the entire country of people who are so deeply 100% committed to the thing that they're doing that they don't know that everyone else isn't doing it.
Right.
Like so deep in the subculture, they don't know it's a subculture.
Right.
And when you can enter into one of those worlds and have the enormous privilege of being let through that wall and introduced to why taxidermy is so important. I just get a huge thrill from it. That was the best part of those years of that kind of writing.
Yeah.
And I did at the beginning when I wrote for Spin when I was very young. I was snarky because I wanted to be funny, and I was trying to prove that I was funny. And the cheapest, easiest, lamest way to prove that you're funny, of course, is to make fun of somebody who has no ability to reply, and no ability to defend themselves against you, who is sort of set up, to be a rube. And I did that probably for the first year that I worked at Spin, and I still wake up in the middle of the night regretting that, and I learned, and I had to learn how to. What I had to learn how to trust was that it's a more interesting story if you don't tear them apart. It's a more interesting story if you show people who they are, rather than, it's too easy to go to the country music festival in rural Georgia and talk about how fat everybody is. It's fish in a barrel,
Right.
But to talk about why somebody would stand in the sun for 9 hours to meet Vince Gill is interesting, and it's more interesting to do it that way. So I have someday I'll have to make amends to those people because I feel a lot of shame about that. But I think again it has to do with youth, and it has to do with insecurity and wanting to make sure that you got the laugh at any cost, and I just won't do that anymore.
Right, and also it's much more challenging, as you say. To say, explain this to me. This isn't my world. So I'm here as a tourist in your world, and I want to understand it rather than saying, "Oh, what a horrible, stupid
bunch
world."
Of freaks.
Yeah, and it's I think the experience, maturity, and a kind of tenderness that comes with feeling, maybe it's just feeling more confident in yourself to be able to not look for the cheap joke and instead say, well, things are funny. I mean, there will be humor.
Right.
But the easy shot is less appealing, and
it's too easy. You know, if it's too easy, how clever can it be?
Right.
And I remember sort of working on that with my students when I was teaching too, like, try harder, aim for compassion, that's the hardest task that there is. See, bring it, see if you have it, like, where is it?
Right.
Mockery is the first doorway, but you have to get past that, and then it'll be better, and it can still be funny, and it can still be engaging, and it can still be quirky, and you can celebrate all that stuff, but yeah, those were the people that I loved the most, Just loved that kind of thing.
I know.
And those were the stories that Susan Orlean was already writing in the New Yorker.
There are only so many people who can cover the World Taxidermy Championship, right? I mean, once you've got one person on the taxidermy beat, you really don't need two. So,
do you know what I remember when I was writing at GQ? I'd been there for about a year, and I had a meeting with the late great Art Cooper, and he had me bring in story ideas, and I had this little list of story ideas, and right before I opened my mouth to pitch all my story ideas, he said, "You know what, Liz, we love having you here, but we feel like it's kind of time for you to get more serious and grow up, and you've done a lot of this quirky stuff, and we like it, but we'd like you to do something meatier. Do you have anything in mind?" And I looked down at my list, and the very first thing on the list said mascot school.
Oh, God!
Because I just found out that there was this place in Florida where all the college mascots go to learn how to be mascots.
Oh,
and I was like, do you have any ideas for things?
Yeah, I'll be back in a minute with my other list, my meaty list.
I'm going to uncover that mascot. I'm going to get right to the bottom of that.
I think there's something rotten in the mascot school, and I'm going to figure it out.
Exactly. Mascot gate. We'll find out what it is.
It's funny, though. I think you and I have so many interests in common and, so many takes on the world that are quite similar. And I always feel very sensitive about it ever being perceived as camp and kitschy, and rather than, an interest in subcultures and
right.
Because I mean, certainly mascot school might not have been your high moment, but
it might have been, because you don't know what you're going to
know.
Find.
You never know.
I never got a chance to do it. Maybe I need to go do it.
Well, I mean, I hope you don't mind if I do that as my next story.
Please. I mean, it would be my honor.
I have one last question, which is, tell me about your dog.
That was going to be my last question for you, and then we'll let you, because I not only want to hear about your dog, I want to hear about your dog book.
Okay.
But my dog is named Rocky, and he's a mutt that was on death row in West Virginia in a kill shelter, and he's the best creature who ever lived, and the best friend I've ever had. And he's normally right here with me, but he's out for a walk with his dad.
And how old is he?
We don't really know, but I think he's about 3, and he looks like a pygmy hyena. I'm getting the DNA test done to find out what he is, because people ask all the time. The other thing he looks like is a wingless fruit bat, and he's very dear. And I'm really happy to say that Ann Patchett met him recently and fell in love with him. And in her new novel, which is coming out next year, there is a dog named Rocky who's named after my dog. So he's kind of famous. So that's my guy. And tell me about Cooper.
Well, Cooper is, it's funny. He's 9, and I find myself having anticipatory wistfulness. I mean, he's very lively. He's in good health and keeps himself busy, and it's kind of wonderful living out in the country where he's out running around and swimming and having fun. But the tragedy of human lives and dog lives running on entirely different tracks is it's insurmountable, and there's nothing good to say about it. And I mean, a 9-year-old dog he's still got plenty of dog life in him, but I can't help but be shocked looking at him and thinking, this was the 7-week-old puppy that sat in my hand, and now he's an old dog, and
he's an old coot.
It's
there's when I was in India, my favorite monk told me that one of the jobs that dogs have in human life is to teach humans how to die, because they do it so well. And one of the points of that discrepancy of dog life and human life is that if you have a lot of dogs throughout your life, you get to watch them do it. And it's part of their service is that they're teaching you.
Yeah.
So that hopefully you will do it as gracefully as they do.
And that,
and I think that's the only comfort.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a very moving and I think very credible way of looking at it, because you love something from the time it's young or whatever age they are when you get them, and you see, unless there's some very unforeseen change in your life, you'll see their whole life cycle complete, and it's just very affecting. And writing a book right now about dogs and many generations of the same character, and
this is the Rin Tin Tin book.
Yeah, and seeing, knowing, I mean, the idea of them constantly being reborn, essentially, but knowing that in the lifetime of the guy who found the puppy originally, that he ended up on his fourth generation of this dog, and that's just the way the cycle works, and I don't think he ever got used to it, and not that I would think that would be an achievement, because you love your creature, and I love my dog, and I feel the dog that I had before Cooper, losing her was terrible, and I didn't get another dog for several years. I didn't really know if I could go through it again, and she had a kind of tough end, and I think that made it a little bit harder, because I think she left this world the way she would have chosen to, but it was a kind of tortured path there, and it was really hard for me, and I at first thought, I don't know if I want to do this again. Maybe it's like refusing to get married again after you've been divorced, or not being willing to have a child after you've gone through labor. I mean, it's human nature that your first thought is never again, and then if you're smart, you go ahead and do it again. But and I would. The idea of not having a dog is very funny to me. But at first, I thought, I don't know, this is tough. So
I remember when one of my dogs died, and I got another, and I told a neighbor, she just grabbed me by the arm, and she said, "Why do we do it to ourselves? Why do we do it?" And we do it out of love and curiosity and the desire to learn and share and grow and be better and happier, and then sadder.
Right. And it's
and
all...
then repeat.
Right.
That's it.
Really.
It's all part of the cycle.
Rinse and repeat. It's all, it is entirely worth it. I think that when Cooper was a little younger, I was much more philosophical about, no, it's wonderful. He's great, and he's 2 years old, and, he'll live forever. And now that he's 9 and I see him slowing down a little, I'm having the post-traumatic stress of remembering that it's very tough to lose a dog, and I don't want to anticipate it, because with luck that won't be something that happens for quite some time, but I'm very aware of it, and I see his gray hairs. It's funny, since he's a redhead and now he's getting very gray and losing his freckles, and as a redhead with freckles, I guess I'm probably projecting a little bit there too. So when does your movie? Your movie is about to come out.
The movie comes out on August 10th. The premiere is August 10th, and I was happy about it. But then I bought this Oscar de la Renta gown to wear to the premiere, and now I'm ecstatic about it. Because I have to say, I kind of think it's all about the dress, and the dress is sort of the best part of the whole thing. So I'm now really looking forward to it. It's going to be lovely.
Well, and if you like your dress, you're going to have a great time. That's the whole thing.
That's it. You can't not have a good... I remember being at a conference once where it was horrible, but I kept looking at my shoes and thinking, I love my shoes. I'm happy to sit here for hours just looking at them. So I think it's going to be better than that at the pre-love premiere. But it was delightful to talk to you, Susan. You were charming,
here.
and it's an honor to meet you. You've been one of my heroes for a long time. And it's sometimes dangerous to meet your heroes because it can be disappointing, but it has not been the case in this circumstance. So,
well, thank you. You're a delight, and I look forward to talking to you again without a camera rolling.
That would be nice.
Right.
Okay, be well.
Enjoy yourself.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.